Welcome to part 1 of this course, Habits of a Teenage Brain.
Our aim is to try and help you generate some awareness of what's going on inside your teenager's head, to understand their strange and sometimes unexplainable habits in terms of their brain function. Because their brain is still undergoing huge developmental changes at this stage of their life. So to understand their behaviours in terms of their brain function really helps with coming up with some strategies which will aim to help you as their parent and your teenagers to deal with the challenges of their habits and their behaviours on a regular basis. I'm sure you often wonder what happened to that cute, even-tempered, happy and well-behaved child. Who is this mini adult who you've cared for more than a decade but you now don't seem to know at all? That sense of despair that you feel is completely normal. Your child is changing, trying to figure themselves out. Their brain and bodies are undergoing extensive reorganisation. Their recklessness, rudeness and cluelessness are not their fault, nor are they your fault. In large part, they are due to their incomplete and disconnected brain. As a parent, you need to remind yourself of this on a daily basis and sometimes on an hourly basis. In this lesson, we're going to discuss the huge changes that happen to your teenager's brain and the way in which that sets up their ways of behaving and their habits. We're also going to touch on how having an incomplete brain during this period in your life can often lead you to behave in an irrational and disjointed manner. And finally, I want to share with you a home exercise to try and help you understand those times when your teenager really needs you and behaves much more like they used to as a child, and compare and contrast those to the time when they're much more independent and seem not to need you and want to spend time away from you with other people in their lives. Adolescence is both perplexing and amazing. It happens between 12 years old and 24 years old, which is always quite surprising for people because your brain is still developing up until you're 24 years of age, so you don't actually reach full maturity until that time in your life. And there are lots of myths about this period of your life, which science has now shown not to be true, and I just want to share some of them with you. The first, and I think perhaps the most common myth out there, is that raging hormones are what drive extreme teenage behaviours and sends them a little bit mad, or they might lose their minds, are the sort of phrases that you might hear. But actually, this turns out not to be true. So hormones, it's true to say, are slightly elevated during this period in your life, but it's actually the way the brain reacts to the hormones and the fact that the brain is still going under huge developmental changes that drives teenage behaviour and habits. So second myth you often hear is that teens are immature and just need to grow up. Well, this is a rather restricted view of this time during your life and sort of suggests that teenagers should be just trying to survive this period. Well, actually, contrary to that, adolescence is really a period in which you want to encourage teenagers to thrive, to test the boundaries, to explore the world, to develop their character that's going to form the basis of their personality when they reach adulthood. And a final myth that's often out there is that children really should just move from dependence on their adults, on their parents, as quickly as they possibly can to be completely independent. Well, again, this is a rather restricted view and doesn't really appreciate the relationship between you as a parent and your child during this period, because teenagers have huge amounts to benefit from you as an adult and your relationship with them. And the typical adolescent behaviours that you often see that are often kind of characterised as these extreme and irrational behaviours are actually completely healthy and natural consequence of the way the brain develops during this period in your life. The brain influences your teenager's mind, it influences their relationships with their friends and their family and their social connections. And for you as a parent to grasp this and know this is hugely beneficial in you trying to understand and get to grips with their inner experiences and their social connections with friends and family. And never before or never again in a teenager's life will they undergo such changes that happen during this period between 12 and 24 years of age. The brain changes most at this period in life than at any stage in your life. And these changes the brain changes during adolescence, we now know seem to set up sort of 4 typical teenage qualities that you see time and time again in different teenagers, in different families, and different circumstances. And I just want to share those with you. So the first one, which is often the most common one, the one that's most talked about, is that teenagers have this sort of ability for novelty seeking, this increased drive for reward, to try something new. Sensation seeking, or risk taking, is another way of saying it. What they tend to do is they upplay the thrill of sensation seeking, but downplay the risks. And this can lead sometimes to dangerous behaviours and even to injury. So the upside of novelty seeking is that teenagers are much more open to change. They're much more willing to explore novelty. They have a huge fascination for life, and they're incredibly good at designing new ways of living and new ways of thinking, and often want to explore and have adventure in the world. So the second of teenage quality is this phenomenon of social engagement, in which they want enhanced connectedness. They want to create new friendships. They seek them out. So the downside of increased social engagement is that sometimes teenagers during this period can become isolated from adults and parents that surround them, and they become surrounded more by other teens and peers, and this can lead to increased risky behaviour, the rejection of adult knowledge and reasoning. The upside to increased social engagement is that it really drives creation and innovation and supportive relationships. And it's research proven that one of the best predictors of happiness and well-being later in life is increased social connectedness and friendships during your teenage years. And the third quality that arises, teenage quality that arises during this period in your life, is increased emotional intensity. And I'm sure we've all experienced that as parents. So where teenagers have this enhanced vitality to life, that unfortunately can lead to a downside in which intense emotions can sometimes spill over into impulsivity or moodiness or incredibly extreme reactions, certainly to criticisms and opinions. The upside to this particular quality, increased emotional intensity, is that they live life with emotional intensity, and therefore they're much more energetic and they have a huge zest for life. And the final teenage quality that comes out of the natural consequences of brain development during this time is this creative exploration and abstract reasoning, new ideas and innovation out there in the world. So meaning that often a negative of this is that teenagers are searching for the meaning of life, and this can sometimes lead to an identity crisis, also makes them a little bit vulnerable to peer pressure, and can sometimes lead them to have a lack of direction. However, the upside to this kind of creative exploration and innovation is if they can hold on to this kind of novel way of perceiving the world and really explore the full spectrum of experiences, they can avoid some of the ruts that adults tend to fall into, and really facilitate living a kind of full life later on. So the brain changes that govern teenagers' behaviour are both a risk and an opportunity. So for you as a parent, if you can really grasp how these brain changes that we've discussed lead to lots of different types of behaviours that sometimes seem kind of extreme and unreasonable, this can really help your teenager through the adolescent period. It can help them and you live both a healthier and happier life. So what actually happens to a teenage brain to bring about these behaviours that we've just described? Well, we know, adolescent boys can shave and teenage girls can get pregnant, so very adult-like behaviours. Yet, neurologically, neither one of them has a brain yet to deal with the adult world. Paradoxically, they have an abundance, a lot more grey matter in their brain. So that's the neurons that form the building blocks of the brain. But they have a huge undersupply. They're lacking in white matter, which is the connective wiring that helps information flow efficiently from one part of the brain to another. So their brain's a little bit like a kind of brand new car that's not actually been road tested yet. And this lack of connectivity in their brain means that the parts of the brain for sensing, thinking, memory, emotions, and also the parts that help with social relationships are actually in place during the teenage years, but they're not fully integrated with each other. And the teenage brain, the disconnected brain of a teenager, explains a lot of their disconnected behaviours. And I just want to give you a few examples of what I mean to illustrate how it reveals why they have a disconnected brain. So one would be the thrill of sex, alcohol, drugs that they might engage in, but without considering the risks of those particular behaviours. Or they might isolate themselves from their parents in their room, but stay up late at night, either watching television or out with their friends. The moodiness and the emotional time bomb that they can be, but yet they don't consider the feelings of others. Or they're incredibly aggressive towards some members of the family, but are also really vulnerable to peer pressure. So you can see these contrasts, these disconnections in their actual behaviours, and that's because their brain is not integrated yet. So during the teen years, the brain wires itself kind of slowly from back to front. So it begins here and gradually works its way forward to the front of the brain here. And it starts with structures at the back of the brain here that help us interact with the environment and regulate our sensations. So things like vision, which is controlled by this part of the brain here, and hearing and balance and touch, and our sense of space in the world. And these mediating brain structures include brain areas called the cerebellum, which is the back of the brain here, which controls your ability to balance yourself and coordinate yourself in the world. The thalamus, which sits right in the middle of the brain, and this is big relay station for transferring sensory information around the brain. The hypothalamus, which is a really basic brain structure involved in our abilities for hunger, thirst, sex, and even aggression. And that virtually the last place to connect up in the teenage brain as it starts to reach maturity is right here at the front of the brain in this area called the frontal lobe. And the teenage brain is actually only about 80% of its way to maturity. And this 20% gap of reaching maturity all lies in the wiring of the brain, which is still thin and still not fully connected up in different parts of the brain, and particularly to the frontal lobe. And this explains many of their sort of puzzling behaviours that you see during teenage behaviour, during the teenage years, like mood swings, irritability, and impulsiveness. And sometimes their inability to follow through and connect with adults, and the temptations to use drugs and alcohol and engage in other risky behaviours. And that's because these are all controlled by the frontal lobe. You can think of the frontal lobe here as really the sort of boss of the brain. It's the executive. It's the thing that controls all aspects of your behaviour and your brain function. It provides our intelligence, our conscious rational thought, regulates our emotions, helps us remember and plan, like, as I'm sure you've experienced, phoning home when you said you would, but then the teenager doesn't. So this is lacking in the teenage brain. I hope you can take away from this lesson that there are lots of myths out there about adolescent behaviour. Things like raging hormones driving them into sort of crazed states that science has proven to be wrong. And actually, teenage habits are a completely normal consequence of the way their brain is developing, the huge changes to their brain during this period of their life. And this is both a risk and an opportunity for both you as a parent and your teenager. If you and your teenager can grasp this relationship between the huge changes to their brain and why this is leading them to behave the way that they do, it can really help develop strategies for helping them manage their behaviours and for them themselves manage their behaviours. Part of the reason is, or a big part of the reason is, the brain isn't fully connected yet. It's not fully connected up. And most importantly, the front part of the brain here, the boss, the executive of the brain, is not connected up with the rest of the brain, which leads to these disconnected and sometimes incoherent behaviours, and it explains a lot of those types of behaviours. So I hope it's helped you to understand the makeup of your teenager's brain, and that actually it's neither an adult brain nor a child brain. So I just want to leave you with an exercise to try at home before you move on to the next lesson.
As will be the case with all our lessons, we will finish with offering you a set of strategies to try out at home with your teenager. This is not intended to create more work for you at a time when you may already be feeling overwhelmed with the demands of parenting a teenager. Instead, this section of our lessons is designed to help you put into practice your new understanding of why your teenager behaves in the ways they do, and to improve your relationship with them. Thinking about what has been shared with you today, I wonder if you can try and spend the next few days reflecting on and paying attention to the circumstances when your teenager needs you, when they want or are able to accept comfort from you, even if these seem really small examples, and then also when they're independent and wanting to be more distant from you. If it helps to remember, write down the circumstances, your experiences and your thoughts and feelings about them. What do you notice? Are you surprised at how much they still need you perhaps? Are there days when they seem fiercely independent and other days when you still see glimpses of the younger child in them? Do you notice perhaps behaviours that map onto what you've learnt in lesson 1? Perhaps you've noticed specific times when the thinking and the emotional parts of their brain do not seem to be working together. If you feel comfortable doing so, please share any of your observations or thoughts with us in the comments. We'd really love to hear about your experiences with your teenager and how you are finding these lessons help you to understand and relate to them better. We'll look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.